book of Hebrews is the last place you want to go to try to prove that Jesus is not God or that he did not pre-exist his human birth. And here's why.
All right, let's see it.
So this is a question for Alex, man. How you doing, man?
Hey,
you mentioned
GodLogic.
Yes, yes, sir. You mentioned in Hebrews 1, God spoke to our, through prophets. Now he speaks to us through his son. And you're saying, where was Jesus then? He should have been active. Regarding Hebrews, I just want to read you this and get your thoughts on this, okay? It's Hebrews 11. It says, by faith, Moses, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So how is it that Moses can be considering Christ's disapproval if Christ wasn't around for him to disapprove?
Yeah, I do think that in this instance, Hebrews is probably presenting Jesus. I don't know about the angel of Yahweh, but certainly we're looking at a high Christology in Hebrews, yeah.
So close.
But, yeah, I see what you're saying. As a retort to the idea of the angel of Yahweh being Jesus, I think that is an excellent point, yeah.
Great job, baby. You see why?
So I've been tagged a bunch in this video and related videos. I don't really know this apologist, but apparently he has a pretty good reputation among apologists. And it seems to me that the argument on the part of the apologist here is that this passage in Hebrews suggests that Moses chose to suffer the disapproval of Jesus, and so Jesus was around during the days of Moses, which refutes Alex's position that even in the book of Hebrews, or at least in the book of Hebrews, Jesus is not yet identified with the angel of the Lord. The problem that I have run into in researching this is that I have yet to find a single scholar who published any peer-reviewed discussion of this passage who understood the reproach of Christ to refer to Christ's reproaching of Moses. Literally every single scholar I looked at interpreted reproach of Christ to be reproach that Moses suffered at the hands of others that was for the sake of Christ or was Christ-like in its characterization. So let me share a bunch of commentaries on this. We can start with William Lane's Word Biblical Commentary of Hebrews 9 through 13. In the red box, the reproach he incurred was abuse endured for the cause of Christ in the specific sense that he identified himself with God's people, sharing their hardship and contempt. And then on the next page, the portrait of Moses as an exemplar of faith who endured reproach on behalf of the Christ has been accommodated to the description of the early experience of the community addressed. In the past, they had publicly endured reproaches and loss because they were identified with Christ and with the new people of God who had been subjected to insult, persecution, and imprisonment. They had been motivated by the certainty that they enjoyed a better and abiding possession, which is contemplated under the metaphor of a great reward. With vocabulary recalling that report, Moses is described as choosing to suffer hardship with the people of God, a choice that entails loss and abuse for the sake of Christ. We can look at David Peterson's Tyndale New Testament commentary on Hebrews in the red box. In essence, Moses is said to have regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. The word disgrace is significant here because the same term was used to describe the insults previously experienced by the recipients of Hebrews, and it will be used again to challenge them to bear the disgrace that Jesus bore. So the experience of Moses and the Israelites in Egypt is linked to the experience of those who boldly identify with the suffering Christ. Some commentators suggest that the author envisages a prophetic consciousness on the part of Moses concerning the suffering of Jesus. In other words, Moses knows what the reproach of Christ is because he prophetically sees the coming of Christ off in the future. But it is more likely that he describes Moses' experience in this way retrospectively. In other words, the author of Hebrews is saying, oh, the reproach that Moses chose to suffer is like Christ's reproach, in my opinion. because of its similarity to the reproach suffered by Jesus and those who follow him. Moses experienced reproach from his own people and from the ruler of Egypt. In this way he suffered the reproach of the coming Messiah with whom he was united by faith. Like Abraham and his descendants in verses 10, 13 through 16, Moses is portrayed as having the sort of faith the author of Hebrews identifies as distinctly Christian. We can look at Luke Timothy Johnson's New Testament Library volume on Hebrews in the red box. According to the Psalm, he talks about how Psalm 88 is relevant here. The reproach of the people and of the Christ are the same. Therefore, if Moses took on the reproach leveled at his people, he also took on the reproach leveled at the Messiah, about whom the later psalmist would speak. It is quite likely that this is precisely what the author meant by his statement in Hebrews 3:5, that Moses was a servant in order to give evidence about things yet to be spoken. We can look at the Anchor Yale Bible Commentary on Hebrews by Craig Kester in the red box, reinforcing the point. The author speaks of bearing the denunciation of Christ. On one level, this evocative expression suggests that Moses suffered reproach in a manner like Christ when he was denounced by his opponents. On another level, the expression establishes a parallel to the situation of the listeners who were denounced like Christ and for the sake of Christ by others in society. We can look at the New Collegeville Bible Commentary on Hebrews by Daniel Harrington in the red box. Faith led Moses to identify himself not with the royal household of Egypt, but rather with Israel as the people of God, even though this meant suffering the reproach of the anointed, and so prefiguring the sufferings of Christ. We can look at Attridge's Hermeneia commentary volume on Hebrews. This is a little longer. This wealth is paradoxically the reproach of Christ. In what sense Moses accepted such reproach has been variously interpreted. The term Christos could be understood generically, and Moses pictured as accepting the reproach involved in being one of God's anointed ones. Scholars adopting this option note that the language of the verse may well be inspired by Psalm 89 or 88, verses 51 through 52. But the Septuagint version does not support the generic understanding of Christos here. In the Septuagint, the psalmist asks for God's help in the face of reproaches against God's servants and against the substitute for his anointed one. If this verse is inspired by the psalm, Moses might be depicted as accepting the reproach that comes with being the forerunner of God's anointed servant. A third alternative, not incompatible with the previous possibility, is to find here an allusion to traditions of Moses as a visionary that surface in the next verse. As such a prophetic seer, Moses could have been understood to be aware of the ultimate perfecter of the faith, the one who would bring God's promises to reality. Sustained by that awareness, he accepted the reproach that accompanied his association with Christ and Christ's people. Such an awareness of Christ is attributed to other figures of the Old Testament by early Christians, and it would not be impossible within the Christological framework of Hebrews. I cannot find a single peer-reviewed publication by a scholar commenting on this passage in Hebrews that understands the reproach of Christ to refer to Christ directing reproach at Moses in Moses' day. Everything I have found understood this to refer to Moses' prophetic vision of Christ's future coming and choosing to suffer the reproaches in like manner as Jesus, or the reproaches associated with following Jesus, or the author of the book of Hebrews is characterizing the reproaches that Moses chose to suffer as Christ-like or as associated with following Christ, because that allows their audience to identify with Moses. I can find nothing that supports the specific interpretation that GodLogic asserted without argument in this question. And so I can find no indication that this passage actually suggests that the author of the book of Hebrews was insisting Jesus was there and active and Moses knew about it in Moses' own day. So I don't find this question to be particularly insightful. I find it to be presuppositional, to be presupposing a specific minority, in fact, as far as I can tell, unattested interpretation of the Greek here solely for the purpose of getting to the desired conclusion, which is that the book of Hebrews obviously identifies Jesus as pre-existing, as being active during the days of Moses. That just does not convince me. And the fit for this video has been the Fantastic Four.